Growing up in our small town felt like living in a bubble of safety. We knew everyone by name, and every house seemed to have an open door. Summers stretched long and lazy, filled with bike rides, games of tag, and secret adventures. My friends and I had our special spot, a half-built house at the edge of the neighborhood. Its skeletal frame was perfect for hide-and-seek, and the dusty floors became our stage for daring stories. For us, it wasn't abandoned. It was magical. That summer, I spent most days there with Mia. She was quick-witted and always a step ahead, her cautious nature balancing out my own trusting one. We'd climb through the hollow window frames and sit on the edge of what might have been a kitchen counter, our legs dangling as we swapped plans for our next adventure. It never occurred to us that the place, with its sagging beams and peeling wood, could be anything but a playground. One afternoon we were deep in a game, our laughter echoing off the empty walls, when I noticed him. He was standing by the fence just beyond the house's edge, watching us. I nudged Mia, and we both froze. The man wore a police uniform, his badge glinting in the sun. He didn't look scary. His expression was almost kind, but there was something in his stillness that prickled the back of my neck. He called out, his voice warm yet commanding, asking if we'd seen a little girl who'd gone missing nearby. Mia grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold against my skin. "We should go," she whispered, tugging me toward the house's back exit. But curiosity held me in place. I told myself he was a policeman. He was here to help. He stepped closer, his hand gesturing toward his car parked a few feet away. "Come here," he said, his tone firmer. "I need to talk to you both." Before I could take a step, Mia pulled harder, her voice louder now. "No, let's go." She shouted my name, not to him, but to the houses nearby. Her voice carried over the fence, sharp and urgent, and I saw the man's face change. His friendly mask cracked, and for a moment he looked angry. Then he turned abruptly, walking back to his car. The door slammed, and within seconds, he was gone, the hum of his engine fading into the quiet. An older neighbor, Mr. Jensen, appeared moments later, a rake still in his hand. He looked from us to the empty street beyond, asking if we were okay. Mia told him everything, her words tumbling out like a flood, while I stood silent, my heart pounding. That night, the house became a forbidden zone, a place none of us dared return to. The police were called, but nothing came of it. The man, they said, had been just passing through. Looking back, I realize how close we came to something terrible that day. The memory of his voice, soft but insistent, still lingers. For years, I wondered why I hesitated, why Mia saw the danger before I did. Maybe it was her instinct, or maybe it was because she had never trusted strangers the way I had. Either way, I owe her more than I can ever repay. That summer, my world changed. The streets didn't feel as safe, and neither did I. Years later, long after I had moved away from the town of my childhood, I found myself on a cross-country road trip with Sarah, one of my closest friends. It was the kind of adventure we had always talked about, driving through the vast, open stretches of America with no real schedule, just us, the car, and the horizon. During the day, the road felt freeing, almost limitless, but at night, the open highway took on a different character. The world beyond our headlights seemed to shrink, leaving nothing but shadows and the hum of the engine. We were somewhere in the middle of nowhere, the sky above us a deep, starless black. Sarah had fallen asleep, her head leaning against the window while I drove in silence, lulled by the rhythmic glow of the dashed lines on the road. Then out of nowhere, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, growing closer with alarming speed. At first I thought it was just another car overtaking us, but it stayed behind, its beams reflecting harshly in my mirrors. The car flashed its lights once, then again, before a short siren chirp cut through the quiet. My stomach dropped. It wasn't marked as a police car, but it had the lights, the siren. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Sarah stirred awake as I came to a stop, groggy but alert enough to notice the tension in the air. The man who approached didn't look like the police officers I had seen before. His uniform seemed unkempt, and his badge looked wrong somehow. He didn't even ask for my license and registration right away. Instead, his questions felt invasive, personal. Where were we headed? Were we traveling alone? My heart raced as I tried to keep my answers short, careful not to reveal too much. Sarah leaned over, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ask for his ID," she said, her tone steady despite the unease in her eyes. When I did, the man hesitated, his expression darkening. He gestured toward his belt, where his hand rested, and told me to stay calm. My fingers felt ice-cold against the steering wheel as I forced myself to nod, playing along, hoping he would just walk away. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back and told me to be more careful next time, though he never explained what I had supposedly done wrong. He returned to his car, and I watched as his taillights disappeared into the darkness. Sarah and I sat there for a long moment, the silence between us heavy. "That wasn't right," she finally said, and I could only nod in agreement. The rest of the night, every car that passed us made my pulse quicken. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. It was like the encounter at the abandoned house all over again. My instincts dulled by the guise of authority, and my survival resting on the presence of someone sharper, braver. Even now, I can still hear his voice, calm and calculated, as if it were designed to make you doubt yourself. Months after that unsettling encounter with the unmarked car, I found myself driving alone late at night on another long, empty stretch of highway. The road was dark, flanked by dense woods on either side, with no streetlights to guide me. My headlights barely seemed to cut through the thick veil of the night. The hum of the tires on the pavement was my only company, a monotonous soundtrack that did little to settle my nerves. The memory of that road trip with Sarah lingered in the back of my mind, a faint echo of unease. I first noticed the car behind me when it was still a distant speck in my rearview mirror. It was moving fast, the headlights growing larger with every passing second until they were almost blinding. My fingers tightened around the wheel as it swerved closer, tailgating me with a persistence that felt deliberate. Then came the flash of red and blue lights, followed by a short burst of a siren. My chest tightened, a mix of dread and disbelief. Again, the vehicle that pulled me over was marked this time, but something about it still felt off. The way it had approached, erratic and overly aggressive, didn't match the professional demeanor I'd been taught to expect. I pulled to the shoulder, the gravel crunching under my tires, and watched as the car stopped behind me, its headlights still glaring. The officer stepped out, his silhouette backlit by the blinding beams, and approached my window. "License and registration," he said curtly. His tone was gruff, almost impatient, and his uniform, though official-looking, seemed slightly askew. As I handed over my documents, I noticed his badge, which bore a department name I didn't recognize. "Do you know how fast you were going?" he asked, though his eyes didn't seem focused on me, but rather darting around, scanning the interior of my car. I told him my speed and watched as he scribbled something hastily on a pad of paper. The ticket he handed me looked strange, the print uneven and the details oddly generic. My instinct screamed that something wasn't right. Summoning my courage, I politely asked for his badge number and the precinct he worked for. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed. For a moment, I thought he might lash out. Instead, he shoved the ticket toward me, muttered something about being more careful, and walked back to his car. As soon as he was gone, I examined the ticket under my dome light. It was full of errors. Details about my car were wrong, and the precinct listed didn't seem to exist. My heart pounded as I realized the encounter wasn't just unsettling. It was likely fraudulent. I snapped a photo of the ticket, noting the car's plate number and the location where it had happened. I didn't want to let this one slide. The following day, I called the local authorities to report the incident. Their response was disheartening, vague assurances that they would look into it, but no real action. Frustration bubbled up inside me. How could something like this happen? How could someone impersonate authority so easily and get away with it? That night, as I lay in bed, the familiar feeling of vulnerability washed over me. It was the same helplessness I had felt as a child, staring at the man by the abandoned house. I thought about how quickly fear can erase logic, how even the smallest crack in someone's facade of authority can make you question everything. More than anything, I hated the way it made me doubt myself. It wasn't just about that ticket. It was about a system that let predators wear the mask of safety. And once again, I was left with more questions than answers. There's a moment just before sleep when memories have a way of slipping into focus. Lying in the dark, I've replayed these encounters over and over, trying to make sense of them. The man by the abandoned house, the unmarked car on the highway, the officer with the fake ticket. They're threads in a tangled story that I can't seem to unravel. What ties them together isn't just fear, but the way they've made me question things I once took for granted. Authority, safety, even my own instincts. After the incident with the tailgating officer, I spent days researching, trying to find answers. I wanted to know who these men were, if they were connected in some way, or just examples of the same disturbing pattern. My search turned up little. A few reports of similar encounters, but nothing concrete. The feeling of being left in the dark was maddening. I reached out to the authorities again, but their responses were frustratingly vague, as though they were as powerless as I felt. It's hard to explain how these experiences linger. They don't just live in my memory. They shape the way I see the world. Even now, when I see a police car in my rearview mirror, my chest tightens, and I instinctively check the locks on my doors. It's not that I distrust all officers. I know there are good ones out there. But the question always looms, how can you tell the difference? That doubt eats away at the confidence I once had. The belief that the world was a place of clear lines between good and bad. As unsettling as these experiences have been, they've also taught me something important. Looking back, I can see how each encounter could have ended differently, how one wrong move, one moment of hesitation, might have led to disaster. But they didn't. I've made it through, not because of luck alone, but because of instinct and the people who have stood by me. Mia's quick thinking that summer day, Sarah's calm resolve on that desolate highway, those moments remind me that even in fear, there's strength. Still, the questions haunt me. Who was that man outside the house? What was his real plan? And the officer on the highway, was he even an officer at all? The lack of answers leaves a hollow ache, a space where closure should be. But maybe that's part of life, learning to live with the unknown, to accept that not every story comes with a neat ending. In sharing these memories, I hope to give others something I didn't always have. Awareness? If there's one thing I've learned, it's to trust your instincts, even when everything around you tries to convince you otherwise. Fear is a powerful force, but so is survival. I'm still here, and that has to count for something. These experiences may have shaped me, but they haven't defined me. Instead, they've taught me how to see the world more clearly, even when it's cloaked in shadows.